I'm Beth Carroll. Leslie Poole is an associate professor of environmental studies at Rollins College. She has a new book out. It's called Tracing Florida Journeys. It's a book on well known explorers and travelers who came to Florida. And she is our guest today. Since you're here, Leslie, what I wanted to start with was actually sort of the newsier piece. Your book is certainly news, it's newly out, but I realized that you are on the board of the Orlando Land Trust, and there was a coup recently in March. Orlando City Council approved the purchase of 4 parcels of land, two of which are located on the shores of Lake Eola Park, will be a big part of a sort of gateway or entrance to that. So would you tell us what the Orlando Land Trust is and kind of speak to why you wanted this purchase to happen?
This is so exciting, Beth. Let me say the Orlando Land Trust has been working doggedly, and I am not the primary mover and shaker, but I am on the board. We were created to try to create green space in Orlando. And right now, adding green space into an urban area is a miracle. We're not preserving, now we're trying to create green. And so this is the second big project that the Orlando Land Trust has been involved in. We also helped purchase a piece of property that's adjacent to one of these units. And what we hope is that now, instead of having a gas station in an old ratty building, now what we'll have is a green entrance into the park from the southwestern corner, and it will provide recreation and green space and all the good things that being outdoors can bring. Lake Eola is a heavily used park. I think it makes downtown living in Orlando wonderful. I think it adds to that, just like any downtown park. And the opportunities to add green space in a major urban area is really remarkable. And we were just really happy to be part of this effort.
And if you would talk about the fact that this started a few years back, actually, these efforts, and is really grassroots, right?
It is grassroots. I mean, it really started originally with this opportunity to buy the old 7-Eleven property. And several people that were at the Rosalind Club, which is a building next door, were really anxious about it, what was happening. And then on our board, we have two former mayors, Glenda Hood and Bill Frederick. We have people, old time Orlando residents, who really treasure the green space, and they want to see the city develop, but they want to try to maintain the city beautiful, right? The motto for Orlando. They want that to continue and looking for opportunities. So it's been a really interesting group to work with, and I'm really honored to be part of their work.
Speak about the fact that this is about people too, because when we think about making it a beautiful park and kind of being able to have bragging rights about it, we often think about the people visiting the city. But this is in the heart of the city where average everyday people who go there to work or live there can get their exercise, enjoy a little art, and breathe in the air and look at the trees, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've never been down to Lake Eola where it hasn't been filled with people. I mean, and different languages and just different backgrounds. And I mean, outdoors in a park, think about the water. I think my blood pressure drops 20 points every time I'm looking at water. The swans, the playground, the people picnicking, and you're right, exercising. I mean, it just speaks to different desires and wants and needs of different people in Orlando. And it's a destination. It's not just a neighborhood park, it's a destination for people. There's events there. And I mean, I just think that it's a gem in Orlando that we want to preserve and enhance now. By adding land to it, we will enhance it. You know, when I have been doing research about grassroots efforts around the state in environmental causes, one of the stories I love to tell is about, the Lake Eola and a woman named Maud Whitman who helped beautify the park. She even went out there and planted plants by herself just to try to get Lake Eola, in the early 1900s, to try to make it more beautiful. I mean, it's down to people individually, and now this is, a nonprofit group trying to add in and continue that work.
Yeah, and you were telling me before we got started about a couple of other things you're involved with, another land trust, for example. And but that story, as well as your own story, kind of paint the picture that as individuals, we kind of think we don't have the power to do that kind of stuff, right? It seems so big and complicated, but very simply, there are things we can do for the environment.
Oh my goodness, this is one of the primary things I teach my students at Rollins, and every single class I teach is the power of one person. We have seen it throughout the state of Florida. I mean, what would the Everglades be without Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and her efforts to be involved, or Nat Reed, who fought for to stop the barge canal and to enhance Biscayne Bay and to save the Everglades as well. I mean, it usually begins, let's say, with one determined person who knows that they're doing the right thing. They truly believe that, and their passion just spills over into the community. And it usually lights a fire under a grassroots movement. And I think that that's how things really do get done, not just in the environment, but in many social causes as well. And it takes one really dedicated person who can inspire the others. And and so I always tell my students, never doubt the power of one person to make a difference.
Yeah. And you know what? That sounds like a perfect way to segue into your book, Tracing Florida Journeys, because you did look at individuals, explorers, you looked at travelers and individual projects that kind of came about, and you've put it into this book. Have I summarized the book well enough, or would you bring out a different sort of focal point?
No, it's so this is a book of absolute love that I have been thinking about and working on for over 20 years. I am a Florida history nerd. I'm a fourth generation Floridian. I love all these stories about old Florida, starting with the conquistadors looking for gold in Tampa Bay. I mean, all the way to Marjorie Rawlings getting on a boat going down the St. Johns River. And I have dragged my family and friends along many times to go follow the routes that different people took coming through Florida. And it's always fascinating to me how many people are unaware of some really well-known travelers who came through Florida. And being in Florida had a huge impact on them. Uh, John Muir walked through Florida in 1867, right after the Civil War. This is before he's the John Muir of the Sierras, right? He hasn't even been to California yet. But as he's walking along and he's collecting botanical specimens, he's also keeping a personal journey. And when he gets to Florida, which was one of his big goal, he wanted to see the subtropical plants and animals. He starts to muse about the human place in the world. And he begins to think to himself, these are all God's creatures, alligators, snakes, you know, beautiful palm trees. These are all God's creatures. Why should we think that we are more important than all the rest of them? And so he's really formulating his philosophy that will carry him through life about the importance of nature. And it leads to his big efforts in preservation in the American West. And he almost dies in Cedar Key from malaria. I mean, we almost didn't have John Muir. I mean, it's an amazing story. He walks the rail lines from Fernandina Beach to Cedar Key and then almost dies of malaria in Cedar Key. And once he gets well, he ends up eventually in California, which was his heart place.
And boy, doesn't that also underscore for early settlers of Florida what they were facing?
Oh my gosh. Well, my family was up in North Florida farming, and I'm sure I keep thinking when I read a lot of these stories that they may have seen the same thing. Part of my family were growing oranges in the Cross Creek area, right near Marjorie Canaan Rawlings, and of course, mine were there earlier, and they got wiped out by the big freezes in the 1890s and ended up leaving the Gainesville area. But that's what they did. They grew oranges in Gainesville, just like Marjorie Rawlings did.
I want to get more of these stories from you, but let's circle back to the process, the research process, if you will. You said that you took some trips just to kind of follow the path. Tell us more about your research process.
So there were some parameters that I chose. I wanted to have different travelers from different time periods so I could look at different aspects of Florida history. They had to be people that there were long accounts written about their travels. It could be personal, it could be different members of like their expedition. And then I went back and retraced where they went to see what's still there, how much has changed. And at the end of every chapter, there's also information for people who might want to go take the same journey. So, for example, for Hernando de Soto, who came to Florida in 1539, he had three members of his expedition who wrote long journal, descriptions of Florida. And of course, their attitude about Florida is, oh, this is a nightmare. Where's the gold? The natives are not friendly. There is no big agriculture. How are we going to feed ourselves? And, we're marching in chainmail through Florida swamps, and they're all it's all a nightmare. None of it is, they never take any look at beauty, and they are there on a, they're on their mission. So looking at that is really fascinating. And of course, we don't really know where DeSoto was in Florida, except there's one site in Tallahassee that has been confirmed and through archaeological evidence, but all the rest of it is speculation. So it was really fun talking to historians and reading different accounts and different news accounts. And there's many communities who claim DeSoto, and they have big DeSoto festivals, but in all likelihood, yeah, he probably wasn't in any of those communities. But it was fun. I enjoyed it, and did a lot of these travels during COVID, when I, instead of being pent up in my house, I could just get in the car and go look for these sites.
So, as far as the journals and things, how do you obtain those?
Oh, well, most of them have been published. I mean, none of
Okay.
these stories are hard to find. There were a few that are all available online now. The beauty of digitized history is amazing. And also I discovered during COVID that there were a lot of experts who were bored as well. And so I could reach them, and they'd talk to me on Zoom. And I reached a lot of people I think that might not have been available had they been busy teaching or out in the field. So it was really fun.
Now, another process question I'd like to ask you about tracing Florida journeys is, you said that people can follow the path that you took in following those paths. So obviously get the book, read the book, and then is it clear enough in sort of the how-to that people could get right to it?
Oh yeah, like at the end of every chapter, we'll have like, here's the park where we think this occurred, and here's an address. Here's where you can find the Cedar Key trestle that probably Muir walked down. Here's the address. Here's the town of Mandarin that Harriet Beecher Stowe lived in and helped found the church. Here's where you can find the church. So and we have some maps. Some things you can't really trace, like there's an expedition across the Everglades that they were just certain they could leave Fort Myers and arrive in Miami in 2 weeks and do a straight line across the Everglades, and they were going to survey it for a railroad line. And it was known as the Ingraham Everglades Expedition. John Ingraham was the leader of it. And of course, it's sheer disaster. There, you don't go straight across the Everglades, especially in 1892. You have to understand the waterways and the sawgrass, and they were clueless. They ran out of food right away. They ended up pushing their boats rather than riding in them. And one guy says, if we hadn't stepped on a few turtles along the way, we would have had nothing to eat. I mean, and they're finally rescued by a Seminole man who comes by in a boat and points them in the right direction and escorts them to Miami. But it's like, the follies of some of our thinking about nature as well. Now you really can't follow that, but we can give you some parks along the way that give you a feeling for what it looked like. I mean,
Excellent.
yeah.
That makes me wonder also about, the indigenous people, and was there some teaching as people came into Florida about, here's how to make your way in this environment?
No, nobody. Well, of course there was, but nobody bothered to really consult with the native people because they considered them pagan, uncivilized. And remember, in the 1830, we tried to kick all of the natives out of Florida anyway. There's the Indian Removal Act. And so the Seminole and Miccosukee people become refugees in the Everglades, and they're not friends with the people coming in. The only really good example of any kind of friendship is William Bartram, who comes through Florida in 1774, and as part of his travels up and down the St. Johns River, he goes with a group of traders to Payne's Prairie, where he meets a Seminole chief named Ahaya. Bartram is in Florida to collect samples. This is the colonial era, and he had a rich plant collector in England who had paid for him to go on the trip. And so when Bartram gets to Payne's Prairie and meets Ahaya, and he stays with this group of Seminoles, the chief gives him an Indian name. He calls him Puck Puggy, which means flower gatherer. And so it's a real indication to me that they saw Bartram as someone who wasn't dangerous or threatening. And it may have even, there's been some speculation that by getting this designation from this very powerful chief, that maybe that gave him safe travels, right? He would have been recognized as a friend, and he would have traveled on. He smoked a peace pipe. I mean, it's a fascinating account. But Bartram, Bartram was a Quaker, and so his view of nature was, that was all sent by God, and he saw the Seminoles as very noble people, unlike the Spanish, who would have seen any native people as a hindrance. So that's really interesting too, is seeing some of these early, perceptions of the native people, and then some of them, like there's an account of Jonathan Dickinson, who's shipwrecked off of Jupiter in the 1600s. He describes an Indian group there that is no longer in existence 30 years later.
Really?
They're gone. And for whatever reason, I would guess probably disease that got spread, warfare, slavery, it could have been most anything. But those people are never seen again. So his account is some of the best or only known written accounts of these different groups. And Bartram is read also as an anthropological study as well.
So you've mentioned sort of the 500 years ago kind of thing, and then more recently, was there sort of a dearth of information kind of between the Spanish explorers and it seems like the 1800s? A lot of sort of information came along about Florida. Were you able to find stuff in between?
Well, again, Dickinson in the 1600s, Bartram in the 1700s. And then you're right, then there's a lot because Florida's wilderness. No one's coming to Florida. Everything south of Orlando is, Everglades. And so most of the people who came through were settlers. And I'm sure that they had wonderful stories, but not any kind of lengthy account like I was looking for to lead my narrative on. And certainly the native population, the original indigenous population has disappeared, and the Seminole and the Kasuki people came in after. They were kind of like the second wave. They don't have a long written history. They're more of an oral tradition. So it was a challenge in many ways. And again, the archaeologists and those who study these native groups are really a huge source of information for me.
So I want to get your perspective as an environmental studies professor. We're going to read the whole book, but what are some maybe trends or standout ideas in the book, maybe as relates to things like water and about the wilderness and kind of moving away and the flora fauna. I mean, I think about those early pictures, the black and white photos from like the 1930s and 40s, where you'll see those big long strings of really huge fish that recreational folks have come down and enjoyed and got. You don't see those anymore, right? Because it's just not happening. So, but what are some of the kind of trends that you see coming out?
You have to take a look at the historic view and then look at it today. So the springs that Bartram saw that just amazed him. I mean, there's nothing he had ever seen anything like it. And he writes about it and it actually inspires British writers to use his descriptions. Those springs now are in trouble. Some of them are starting to gather algae and the outflow is not as good. And they've been polluted with chemicals and phosphates and all that come from our septic tanks and our fertilizers, from the modern age. So some things have changed. Some are the same. Marjorie Rawlings did a boat trip from the St. Johns River all the way to up the Ocklawaha River, as did Harriet Beecher Stowe. But you can't do that trip anymore because it's partially blocked by the old Florida Cross Florida Barge Canal project, where they built a dam on the Ocklawaha River, so it's no longer navigable all the way to Silver Springs. Silver Springs was once the premier inland destination in Florida for tourists. They would take steamboats down the rivers to get to it. Silver Springs is still beautiful in today's, looking at it today, it still looks beautiful. But if you saw it 50 years ago, it would have looked very different because now it's got the same pollutants and algae issues going on and some invasive species in it as well. And the monkeys are not native at Silver Springs, by the way. Can I just throw that in? They were tourists. They were put there as a tourist attraction. So that is not natural either. So there's some of that as well.
What are some of the stories that are sort of front of mind for you that you'd like to share in the book from the book?
I really loved reading Zora Neale Hurston's accounts, first about going to visit turpentine camps in the Shamrock area up near Chiefland, Florida. And her description of what a horrible hard life that was for people who worked in the turpentine camps. And she was sent there as kind of a how would you say, front person for the Federal Writers Project. This is during the Depression, and there's federal money available to try to inspire writers and artists. And so she was part of a team out of Jacksonville, and she was sent in to go talk to turpentine workers so that they would agree when the white crew showed up to interview them, be tape recorded, because most of the turpentine workers were all Black and very impoverished and living really kind of in economic slavery. So she goes up and interviews a bunch of people, and sure enough, the team shows up with, and Stetson Kennedy, a famous Florida historian, is there to do the tape recordings. But if she hadn't been there to kind of prime the pump, sort of, I don't think that they would have gotten any of their interviews. So it's interesting to see how she mixes with the people and understands them and records their memories. She also goes to Polk County to a sawmill operation, and she stays with the workers at the mill and records their stories and songs and poems, and talks about going out to parties with them. And it's just, I feel like it's a point of view that no one else could have captured, because as an African American woman, she had access to these populations of workers who had wonderful stories, just great stories, but they would never have shared them with anyone outside of that culture, I think. And because she'd grown up in Eatonville, she had heard the stories and heard the tall tales. And even though she'd gone to New York City and been part of the Harlem Renaissance and had gone to Barnard College, she could just as easily, she was a chameleon who could slip back into the language and dialogue and dialect of the working class as well. So that to me is really fascinating. That's just an ability that most of us would never have. When she showed up at the camp in Polk County, she was driving her new car that she was very proud of and had on a new dress. And immediately all of the lumber mill workers thought that she had to be like part of the police or the government. And so they wouldn't talk to her. They were very suspicious. So she made up a story where she told them that she was on the run and that her boyfriend was a moonshiner and this was his car. And then she let the sawmill workers drive in the car. And so then all of a sudden she was accepted and she was part of the community. She's a funny, fascinating character, and a great academic as well.
As you share this, it makes it clear, we could go in thinking this is about the environment, but it's about the people within the environment.
Absolutely.
What would you say, or what is your goal for readers when they read this book, Tracing Florida Journey? I mean, entertainment at the start, or?
Well, what I'm hoping is two things. First, I'm hoping to inspire people to get out and take their own journeys. Go follow these people, read some Florida history, go out on your own expedition and see for yourself. And then my deepest desire is that if you go and do that, you will fall in love with Florida and you will fall in love with the nature that's still there. And that maybe then you'll want to help protect it. Because I think falling in love is really crucial to also wanting to help protect areas in the state. And I love Florida. I have lived here almost my entire life. My family has deep roots, and that's, that to me is a no-brainer. But we have so many newcomers who come to Florida and they don't know these stories and they haven't been to these places. And I'm hoping this will inspire people to do that.
The book is called Tracing Florida Journeys. Any final thoughts for us about it?
Florida is an adventure. Go out and enjoy it and find your own here. This has been a wonderful project, and I love talking about it, and I hope other people will be inspired to do the same. Thank you so much for letting me speak.
Leslie Poole is an associate professor of environmental studies at Rollins College.